The Territorial Defense Forces of Ukraine have played a significant role in the first months of the current war in Ukraine. These units are made up of volunteers who have proven to be highly motivated fighters, despite the general low level of training. This was for me a reason to delve deeper into their origins and development. The Territorial Defense Forces came into existence in the spring of 2014, when the armed conflict in Donbass broke out between separatists and forces loyal to the government in Kiev. The Ukrainian professional army performed so poorly that local governments decided to create entirely new units from locally recruited volunteers as a parallel force next to the Ukrainian army. The purpose was to create units which could serve as a first-ditch defense in case rebellious forces would enter territories beyond the Donbass. These units would erect roadblocks and otherwise slow down a rebel advance. In March, 9 battalions were raised. In April, 13 new battalions were established, and in May, the number of battalions had grown to 27. By the summer of 2014, the danger of a separatist advance from Donbass into southern Ukraine had subsided, and the conflict had evolved into a largely static defense along a fixed front line in the Donbass itself. Meanwhile, the territorial units had been organized into a battalion structure and were placed under the effective command of the Ukrainian army. The army was under heavy pressure from the separatists in the Donbass, which were at that stage covertly supported by the Russian army. As a result, the 1st Territorial Battalion was sent to the front line in Donbass in July 2014. By August, the number of territorial battalions had grown to 42, and they have been increasingly put into the front line against the separatists. In August 2014, the Russian army supported a separatist attack against the Ukrainian army around Ilovaisk. It was during this battle that the limits of the hastily formed and trained territorials became evident, when the 5th Territorial Defense Battalion broke and ran in the face of sustained artillery fire. This battalion was eventually disbanded in disgrace in January 2015. Despite their shortcomings in terms of training, equipment, and commanding officers, the territorial battalions were an indispensable source of motivated manpower for holding the front line in the Donbass until the fighting subsided in the summer of 2015. From the beginning of 2015 onward, the territorial battalions were largely absorbed into the mechanized units of the regular Ukrainian army, and the territorial defense battalions had to be re-established. It was a testament of their fighting spirit and maturity in battle within a span of just 1 year. In 2015, Poland even adopted the Ukrainian model of territorial battalions for its own local defense forces. Fast forward to May 2021, the Ukrainian government gave a new impulse to the territorial defense units by creating a cadre of professional soldiers of 10,000 men. The idea was to rejuvenate the territorial forces by a strong core of professional soldiers and making the Territorial Defense Force a separate branch within the Ukrainian army from the 1st of January 2022 onward. The new cadre was deemed sufficient to absorb 130,000 reservists, mostly older civilians, and with a sprinkling of veterans from the Donbass War of 2014-15. The existing battalions would for this purpose be expanded into 25 brigades, with an average of 4 to 6 battalions each. All of this coincided with the rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and the process of expansion was still going on when the Russian forces entered Ukraine. The territorial defense units in 2022 have roughly the same mission as in 2014. They have to prevent a quick Russian or pro-Russian takeover of important cities and administrative buildings. They would also be deployed to protect military objects in the rear, like airports and ammunition dumps, against infiltration and sabotage, and perform other security duties. Last but not least, they would perform sabotage and resistance activities in areas occupied by Russian forces. In February 2022, the Russian army penetrated so deeply into Ukrainian territory along such a long front line that many territorial defense units inadvertently became involved with the actual fighting. The mobilization and involvement of the Territorial Defense Forces boosted the numbers of the Ukrainian army, quite literally. The Ukrainian Professional Ground Army had 125,000 men in active duty and 250,000 mobilized soldiers. The Territorials had initially 10,000 men as a cadre and 17,000 members on active duty. On top of that, at least 100,000 men volunteered for the territorial defense in March 2022. This meant that the planned expansion into 25 brigades was realized almost overnight. If we take these numbers of a total ground army strength of a little over 500,000 men as a baseline, it means that almost 1 out of 4 of these forces are territorials. These territorials were located in their home provinces, but as 12 out of 24 provinces were impacted by the Russian ground operations, it meant that these forces were drawn into the fighting in one way or another. These units would garrison the major transport junctions and urban areas on the path of the Russian advance columns. They also would attack the supply columns in the rear of Russian forces, for example, in the Kiev, Chernigov, and Sumy regions in February and March. They were the men who would stalk around with javelins to hunt Russian vehicles. The territorials were for a large part responsible for the harassing attacks and the stubborn hedgehog defense in the northern regions, which forced the Russians to abort their assault on the Ukrainian capital. The Russian strategy to focus on the Donbass from April onward had inadvertently, as a result, the role of the territorials diminished, because the number of attacked regions diminished from 12 to 7. It also meant that the Ukrainian army could rely to a lesser extent on the territorials for direct support, except for some battalions which were already there. But in order to be able to tap into this pool of manpower, the Ukrainian government decided by the end of April to move territorial battalions to occupy the second line of defense as a rear guard in Donbass. By the beginning of May, the territorials were, however, committed to the front line and have been fighting in the Donbass ever since. In February and March 2022, the Ukrainian territorial forces excelled in their intended role. They defended their home turf with a mixture of small-scale hit-and-run tactics and sheer bravado. Their morale was high due to the sense of national alarm by the Russian attack on the Ukrainian capital. The lack of training and leadership was made up by their high fighting motivation and the fact that the Russian army was suffering from low morale and were a kind of lost in the new war situation. By May 2022, this situation has drastically changed. Donbass is an area most of the territorials are not familiar with, and where they could not automatically count on the sympathy of the population. There, the war was fought in trenches and fixed positions. No more hit and run, but instead artillery duels in which the Russians excel. Here it becomes clear that there have been not enough time to train sufficient officers and NCOs to carry the expansion into brigades and lead the troops in conventional combat operations. The troops themselves have also not been trained sufficiently to adapt to this new situation. Their relatively light armament is of little use against Russian tanks and artillery, which is pounding them from a safe distance. 8 years after the formation of the first territorial battalions, these forces find themselves back in the front line, first around Kiev and the eastern frontier, but also in the intense fighting in Donbass. They remain, in other words, an indispensable force for the Ukrainian army.